are listening to In Pursuit of Development with Dan Bannock.
The United Nations is facing its worst financial crisis in decades. Compared to its 2023 peak, total UN spending has fallen by almost one-third. While some countries have withheld much of their funding, others are paying late, and still others have reduced or postponed contributions. As a result, many UN agencies are being forced to do less with less, leaving more than 100 million people in urgent need of life-saving assistance. But behind this crisis lies a larger story about how international bureaucracies work. While we often scrutinize national public administrations, the international public administrations that manage global governance remain largely invisible. Within the UN system, tens of thousands of officials across agencies such as WHO, UNDP, and UNESCO form a vast administrative network. They draft policies, they deliver aid, and they translate diplomacy into action. Their effectiveness depends not only on competence, but on how they are funded, managed, and not least, trusted. And in today's environment, those foundations are under extraordinary strain. The UN's response has been an ambitious but controversial effort known as UN80, launched to mark the organization's 80th anniversary. It aims to streamline operations, review mandates, and merge overlapping bodies. But as my guest warns, trying to reform the UN amid a liquidity emergency is like rebuilding an aircraft mid-flight. The system's three foundations, money, mandates, and majorities, simply don't align. Funding is fragmented, mandates overlap, and political will among 193 member states is elusive. So much of what is called reform today perhaps amounts to cutback management, freezing posts, closing offices, and relocating staff to cheaper duty stations. At the same time, countries in the global north are not just giving less, they're giving differently. Over two-thirds of UN funding now comes through earmarked projects designed to reflect donor priorities rather than collective ones. This, of course, fuels fragmentation, inefficiency, and mistrust. The less donors trust the UN, the more they earmark. And the more they earmark, the less coherent the system becomes. So what does a post-aid world mean for the United Nations? Can it still fulfill its universal mission when its finances and the very idea of multilateralism are under pressure? In today's episode of In Pursuit of Development, I speak with Dr. Ronnie Patz, an independent UN financing analyst and co-author of Managing Money and Discord in the UN. We discuss how international bureaucracies really function, what's driving the UN's financial breakdown, and what meaningful reform might look like in a world where both trust and money are running short. If you find this conversation useful, please share it, rate the show, and help spread the word about In Pursuit of Development. It's the best way to keep these global discussions alive. Ronnie, it's lovely to see you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dan, for having me. Great to be here.
I wanted us to start the conversation by focusing on something that I hadn't really thought of before I began to, read your work. For somebody like me, I've done some work on local public administration, national public administrations. There's a lot of work in academia on public administration, on implementation, policy formulation, influence, etc., looking at the role of bureaucrats and what motivates or demotivates them. Now, what I didn't realize is that there is comparably far less attention, even in academia, on international public administration, on these huge bureaucracies, the United Nations system. There's so many bureaucrats working on global governance. So the question I have for you to kickstart our conversation is, why is there a shortage of attention? Why have we not put greater attention on IPAs, or international public administrations?
Yes, I think this is the starting point of a research endeavor that colleagues of mine started maybe 15, 20 years ago, depending on how you count the first kind of major publications. And I think there are two reasons for why the bureaucracies of international organizations are not so much in focus. There was a big period for that in the 1960s, 70s, when you look into the international public administration journals, you find studies on UN staff, UN bureaucracy at the time. And even in international relations journals, scholars were looking much more deeply into the inner workings of the administrations of international organizations. But somehow this topic got lost over time because international relations scholars were more interested over time in the big geopolitics, the peace and war, the international trade topics. And they didn't think that those bureaucracies mattered enough, at least for those topics. While I think the public admin community got deeper and deeper into a mix of qualitative but also quantitative studies. And obviously, you can compare, 50 local administrations, but with a relatively reasonable research budget, while doing 50 international organization bureaucracies requires a lot more effort. And the second thing is access to information, right? I talked to other colleagues who have worked on UN finances, one of my topics of interest. And 20 years ago, 30 years ago, they were getting faxes, from IOs in whatever, Geneva or Paris, to just have basic information that I can Google today. And so I think over time, when people wanted to have more information but couldn't get it, they just left this topic behind. So the short story is, I think there was a kind of convergence of interest from different disciplines in the early 2010s to get back to these topics. And I was called into that community through a research project at Munich University in 2014.
When I've done work on the Indian civil service, the Indian administrative service, IAS, a long time ago, maybe over 2 decades ago, when I did the initial work, one of the surprises for me was that I thought people would not want to waste time talking with me, the bureaucrats. Mm-hmm. But it surprised me that they actually felt a bit liberated. They thought this was fun. It wasn't the usual stuff to talk to an academic, to talk about some of the challenges. It felt like I was doing them a favor by giving that kind of attention. And so once you have, and in the old days, if you remember, we had the business cards. Once the business cards goes in and they think you're worth their attention, you get access, and then they open up this huge network. And my impression is that, as you rightly say, in the international public administration, that kind of access has been far more difficult, and increasingly so perhaps because of what is often perceived to be controversial, or people don't want to speak out of turn. They're afraid that their bosses will get angered, something like that. And there's also, I think, a cultural element to this, depending on which organization, which country a particular individual is from. I'm sure there are lots and lots of challenges, but let's hone into the United Nations system. And by the way, I've lost track of how many UN agencies there are. I mean, if you look at the map, there are the funding agencies, the core agencies, and the support agencies, and there are smaller agencies. How would you describe, Ronnie, the UN civil service as we see today? Is it based on merit, the recruitment system? Is it as attractive as I remember it to be a few decades ago? And we'll talk about the lack of money in the UN system, but the UN civil service, how would you characterize it today?
For those who are not into the United Nations system, right? Most people hear about the UN when they hear about the General Assembly, the Security Council. And obviously, there's already international officials working around those bodies, right? Servicing the meetings, making sure the expertise is there for running committees and everything. But that's a relatively minor part of the bureaucratic system of the United Nations. When I describe the UN, I always talk about the UN core, which is basically the New York, the Geneva, the Nairobi, and the Vienna core system of the UN. So those are the global headquarter cities, with Bonn in Germany emerging as a growing location, with Rome as a kind of food-focused location, and with places like Bangkok that have a more regional hub role within the system. This core system consists of UN officials of all levels, from the Secretary General of the UN, which is the the highest public servant of the UN system, and obviously somebody most people who know the UN also know. But below that level, you have a typical public sector, public service, as you would know it from many national systems with hierarchies and structures that are, if you look at an organizational chart of the UN or many of its bodies, that looks like, you would find it in a national administration. What has happened over the last decades, more and more, at least more and more, as far as we can observe, is a system where this core administration, which goes beyond New York, has been supplemented by often organizational parts that start off as funding bodies. Something people might know is UNDP, the UN Development Program. It started off as a fund of the UN system to pay for technical assistance activities around the world. And it grew so big that it became its own organization with its own bureaucracy, worldwide offices, over time. And so you have those kind of fund-oriented structures that look like public agencies might look, under a national government bureaucracy that, devolved agencies or something like this. The thing is, because of the situation, how the whole system is organized, so we can go into more detail, there is a core workforce that looks very normal. And then there's a huge workforce, which can be called invisible or shadow or zombie, depending on the severity with which you want to characterize it, which is consultants of all kinds, because there are projects which just run half a year or a year, so you don't hire somebody on a UN contract. There's a lot of fluctuation of experts who move between different bodies and who are never employed for more than 1 or 2 years in the same UN structures. And I think this looks different to the majority of national administrative systems or local administrative systems that we study. Doesn't mean that there's no mobility in national administrations, but I think there is a degree of mobility of this shadow workforce that is often overlooked.
So when we talk about the 100,000 figure, I've seen this thrown about 110. I don't know. What is the exact amount? Let's say around 100,000. Are we talking about the core personnel or also the consultants and the temporary contractors?
So the 110, 120,000 figure is the officially reported numbers on the UN database where those figures are published. And this covers the core staff, the regular staff, and also, to my knowledge, only the staff with a contract of 1 year or longer. So my guesstimate, and this is really hard to do because the individual organization figures, we talk about 40, 50, 60 different offices and organizations of the UN. They are reported very differently in different sources, but I would expect at least double that amount. And the first time I really realized the size of the shadow workforce was when I studied UNRWA, the UN Palestine Refugee Agency, which has 100, 200 core UN staff, which are paid through the UN budget and some extra budgetary contributions. But then they had close to 30,000 local staff, which would not even appear in the official staff figures in the...
Why is that the case?
Because if you are a UN official, you get special protections, you get special funding scales, which are decided by the International Civil Service Commission, and with a UN system that's largely dependent, and we can talk about this later, on voluntary funding. Having a lot of those staff in parts of the organization which have only annual funding through voluntary funding on the regular payroll is just seen as too expensive.
Cutting costs, giving them lesser protection, right?
But it's also sometimes a signal to the outside world. I mean, for UNRWA, it is, technically speaking, it's not a permanent organization. Its mandate is renewed every 3 years since 1950. But technically speaking, it's not a permanent bureaucracy. And so it's also a signal, a bureaucratic signal to the world, this is not permanent stuff.
But also the fact, as you know, in many of our elections, a lot of the discussion is about the growing role of the state, that it's becoming too many public servants. We need to shrink the bureaucracy. And maybe there's also that conscious attempt by UN agencies to not project that they are growing so fast that, they need to be cut or something. But going back to, let's say, the core staff, as in national bureaucracies, Ronnie, there's always a few ministries and departments that or directorates that are seen to be more prestigious than others. And I'm thinking about a conversation I had with a colleague of mine, Desmond McNeil, who was doing a study. This is several years ago. And we were talking about which UN agencies are seen to be more prestigious or influential. And he said something like UNDP is seen to be very influential. Like the World Bank Group, obviously within the UN system, is super influential. And then you have many others at the bottom. I remember, I think this was UNESCO was mentioned as one of those, but there may be smaller agencies. Now, if you think about an international bureaucrat who wants to work for the UN, where would she or he aim for if you really wanted to go to the most prestigious posting at the moment?
I think it depends a little bit on the level that you're going for, whether you're entering as a senior official, maybe chaperoned by your national government to have a leading role, or whether you work kind of, bottom up, beginning of your career, kind of organizational career for you. I think there is a shift across the system. I would still believe that people want to work in the big diplomatic hubs like New York, like Geneva, because you have not just the single organizations, but you have ecosystems to talk in. Some colleagues have done research on the ecosystem of Geneva a couple of years ago. And so I would say, the human rights system for Western diplomats or career officials, probably quite clearly everything around the Security Council, the peacekeeping, is probably quite prestigious, even for a global crowd of people who want to work for the UN. But then there is the question of what can I do as a young official joining the system, right? And as people know from maybe national bureaucracies and national diplomatic services, when you're in a small embassy as a diplomat of your country, you are the second in line and make decisions. At the same level in the home foreign ministry in the capital, you are just a small wheel in a big machine doing nothing, right? So I think somebody who wants to move things and wants to be in touch with the real world, you may still go for development agencies, field offices like UNDP, like the World Food Program, like UNHCR, the Refugee Agency. And some of these agencies also have what we found in research, a more entrepreneurial spirit, right? Which means that if you are somebody who goes into international affairs, even as an administrator, so to say, but you want to move things, you probably are not the ones sitting in multilateral meetings and writing protocols, right? So I think it also depends a little bit on the style of work that you're interested in as an official.
One of the many criticisms I hear around the world, particularly in the global south, perhaps also in our parts of the world, we'll come to one criticism slightly later, which has to do with the overlap of functions, and that is related more towards UN reforms. The other set of criticisms I often hear is almost the jealousy one feels if you are in the local public administration for how well the UN officials are paid. And this goes back to what we were just saying, that, the ones that are centrally contracted as part of the UN system, wonderful benefits and retirement packages, and children get free tuition, and just the whole package is so attractive, tax-free. And a lot of the national bureaucrats feel that is so unfair. But related to that, Ronnie, is also the criticism that this leads to a lot of waste. That do we really need to pay UN officials as well as they are?
Let's start with the second part, the waste, right? Personally, I have no hard feeling for anybody earning this amount of money, but I can definitely see that the bigger the gap between what you earn as an international official and local income, the more unjust the system will feel, right? And probably from a Geneva perspective, where costs are high, a high salary doesn't feel as high as when you are in a duty station with lower costs. But I think the problem is that those decisions are made by member states, right? It's not the UN bureaucracy deciding that they, on their own earn this amount of money, but member states in the International Civil Service Commission, and then through the General Assembly confirming those decisions, they decide those big salaries and those adjustments to different duty stations. So if the collective, Global South, which has the majority in the UN General Assembly, wanted to push for lower salaries, they could do so, but they don't. And maybe the reason is that once you have persons in the UN workforce from your country, you don't want them to suffer, and you don't push those things at the global level either. So remind me the first question. Sorry, I'm just...
Are we really recruiting the best people? Is this become an arena just to, lounge around and enjoy these benefits? Is this value for money in terms of what one is getting in terms of these international civil servants?
In my line of research, I've mainly focused on officials at headquarter level with a bit of what's called the field, so country level or regional officials.
And even in those locations where you could say, those are just middle managers, earning a good salary and, they could have a good life, I don't feel that this is the type of personality who is in those organizations. I think some of the criticism, as probably with most public administrations, is based on a few dark horses, that are revealed to be lazy, are revealed to be corrupt, which always happens the bigger the organization. But it's not the type of person that on average I have met in those agencies. And I think what's a bigger problem is the discrepancies within the same offices. People who have those high salaries, people who are as international officials in the system, people who have a different type of salary because they're employed as national officials, and then the whole consultancy crowd that maybe earns money once the project comes in, but then is unemployed for another half year. And so they may earn a lot of money for this half year, but the other half year they may not, right? So people see what they earn when they work, but they don't see what they don't earn when they are not working. And so, this is my scientific academic perspective. I hate to generalize on an entire system of officials, but I want to give you one example that really also gives a different perspective to this. A lot of the things that don't work within the UN system when bureaucrats don't work is because they get badly managed by the collective of member states who don't often know what they want, who don't give clear guidance. And so bureaucrats maneuver between very different interests. From the outside, it looks like they're not doing anything. But on the inside, it's preventing to make anybody so unhappy that, diplomacy kicks in. And so there is a lot of work in what a colleague has called emotional labor that international bureaucrats do in working with member states. And from the outside, it looks like they were doing nothing. On the inside, they are, they're doing a big job and not resulting in massive fights,
And there's a huge difference, as you rightly point out, between whatever is called a P5 or a P1, all these position categories, they carry different responsibilities. But there's also this other element, I think, Ronnie, in all fairness, many of these officials are posted in very difficult circumstances. If you're posted in Afghanistan, in war-torn areas, civil war regions, Sudan, you have to somehow compensate. It's this kind of compensation for, I wouldn't say punishment postings, which is what is the category used for local public officials that are sent to these really difficult situations that nobody else wants to be posted to. But these are challenging postings. And as you said earlier, these can also be actually good for your career when you've been sent to this really difficult post. And of course, you need to be compensated for that. You may be able to, really carve out a niche for yourself and be promoted. Let's jump quickly to UN financing. Now, I know this is your pet theme.
It is.
You've been crunching a lot of figures. You've been looking at records. You've been looking at reports. And you've been also looking at this whole ongoing UN80 reform process. Now, first, Ronnie, how bad is the problem? And I know that with the Trump administration cutting, a lot of aid, a lot of UN agencies feeling like they're being left out, they don't have the member states backing like they used to. How bad is the situation in 2025 relative to what I'm told, and I read in one of your papers, was the high point of 2023 when the UN had, I think, the highest funding ever, right? So is there like a 30% drop or something now?
Yes. So in 2023, you have to remember this was the end tail of the COVID crisis, where a lot of funding went into the system to deal with the health, but also the development and humanitarian aspects of this crisis. And we had 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which raised not just a lot of funding requests regarding refugees and displaced persons, but also we had the global food crisis. And so agencies like the World Food Programme had to receive much more funding to help with food around the world and deal with higher prices also. So we talk about a peak at around $70 billion for the entire United Nations system, which, when you think of it, the core of this funding is the $3.6 billion of the core UN budget that pays for the General Assembly and the regular stuff around it. Maybe another 6-7 billion for peacekeeping on top. So let's say 10 billion is like the core of it. And then the rest of the money is voluntary funding for the 50 plus agencies we're talking about. The estimate is that in 2025, we are going down to around 50 billion for the entire system, with 2026 being more. So that's around 30% cut, and not within, a year or two, but within a month or so, right? With Trump coming in and basically saying, even money we promised to pay in voluntary funding, we cut. If you imagine a national government cutting 30% budget for all agencies within 5 weeks or 10 weeks, that would be chaos in a national system as much as it is in the UN system. And on top of this comes the fact that the US seems to be unwilling to even pay its official member state fees, the assessed contributions as they are called.
But they do pay a higher amount than all the other countries, right?
They are in the top tier of the payments. 22% of the regular budget is what they should be paying, a bit more for peacekeeping. So out of this 10 billion regular budget plus peacekeeping, they pay some 2 billion or so in sum. But they have decided not to pay this in full or in large parts. It's not fully confirmed what the final figure or non-figure will be for this year. But the problem is that the UN has an adopted budget of a certain size, but now doesn't have the cash to actually spend, the salaries and pay for the salaries and the activities that it is budgeted to do. And on top of this, China in the last 3-4 years has decided to pay its own contribution later and later in the year, which makes the cash flow management across the year even harder for the organization. So basically, by spring this year, the core UN in New York, Geneva, and so on, were already planning with a 600 million underspending of the adopted budget. And I think they will not end at this figure if the US is not paying at all this year. This has, different consequences. In reality, in the core UN, there is now a shadow budget, with vacancies of people not hired, although there is formal positions for them. There are peacekeeping missions which are still happening, but the true contributing countries like Nepal, India, Bangladesh don't get back the money for those troops. And there is the large part of UN agencies that are project-based funded, like the International Organization for Migration, which basically had to fire people from one day to the other because their projects that were planned were not happening or were not paid for.
But Ronnie, help us understand, when the UN was designed, what was the mechanism for member states to pay their share? Obviously, the United States, being a superpower, being so rich, took on itself a huge burden, as in, a duty to pay, which now it seems to be rethinking. And now we've seen the world changing. We're seeing a geopolitical shift. As you mentioned, China has become an important player, is funding several of the UN agencies. A lot of Chinese officials are in senior positions, and thereby China, I think, feels more of a responsibility. I'm thinking of UNDESA. You have India and you have the Global South, so you have more sort of power centers, but also sources of cash. Mm-hmm. Is that one of the many reasons why rich countries feel that they should not be paying? Because this is something I've been hearing for many, many years, even when I was studying political science and IR, that member states promise something, but they don't really pay their dues. And sometimes they're paying late. So how does this work? And what was the enforcement mechanism for? Is this like a naming and shaming? And then it wouldn't really work or be very effective.
Yes. So in broad strokes, the core funding of the UN from the beginning was meant to be through an assessment scale that would reflect the economic strength of countries, right? In a simplified world, the more economically strong the overall country is, the more they pay. Over the decades, this would have meant in certain periods that the US would have had to pay 30% or more. And at some point, and at different points actually across history, they were saying, not more than 30%, not more than 25%. So the upper limit at the moment is 22%. So that the US actually is at that limit. China this year moved up to 20%, so just 2% behind the US. So the two together are responsible for 42% of the regular budget of the UN, and it's even more on the peacekeeping.
I didn't know that. China is such a big player.
In the last 15 years, China has moved from 5% to 20% this year. So those two countries, if they don't pay or if they pay late, they bring the crisis to the organization just by them, being the way they are at the moment. What comes on top is if maybe in the whole UN system, because when you look at WHO or UNESCO, which are called specialized agencies, those specialized agencies, they are independent international organizations under the UN system roof. They also have their assessed contributions. So basically, member states pay another obligatory membership fee for those agencies. But maybe this whole assessment in total might be, let's say, 15 billion out of the 70 billion in 2023. All the rest is voluntary funding, which meant that the US, on top of its 2-point-something billion contributions that they had to pay as assessed, paid another almost 10 billion voluntarily, which China doesn't do. China pays almost no voluntary funding to the UN system, which meant that the US, what they did this year is they cut a lot of the voluntary funding and they're not paying their obligatory assessed funding. And so agencies lose double money, the core money and the voluntary top-up, so to say. This voluntary funding has always been there in the UN system, but it's only recognized in research, at least, as a core thing in the last 2 decades, maybe. Erin Graham has written her PhD on WHO funding, a recent book on money and multilateralism, showing how well-meaning donors, by giving voluntary additional money to the system because the core funding wasn't enough, they created a system that was more and more reliant on this type of funding. And on top of being voluntary, a lot of this funding is also earmarked, which means that it's not that Germany gives 100 million to UNDP and says, please look around the world where development is most needed and spend the money. But Germany is saying, UNDP, here is money for a project on gender in Somalia. Implement that. Maybe there's some negotiations going on, whether it's Somalia or Ethiopia, But in essence, a lot of the funding is actually earmarked for geographic and policy goals, which makes this basic idea of a core budget overhauled. And then on your question on, can you punish people for not paying? You cannot punish them not to pay voluntary funding because it's voluntary, right? So in the charter, there is Article 19 that says if a country doesn't pay 2 years of its dues, it can lose or should lose its voting rights in the General Assembly. If you're the US and you use your voting rights in the General Assembly, you have 1 vote out of 193. You still have your veto in the Security Council. You can still sit in all meetings. Does it really hurt you, especially an administration that gives a shit, if I may say this in the words of the president himself, probably? No, right? And I can give the example of UNESCO. In 2011, UNESCO admitted Palestine as a member, and the US has a law that says once Palestine joins as a member state, the US cannot pay, or at least had. I'm not sure if the law still exists in the same way. It meant that the US stayed a member of UNESCO, but didn't pay. They lost their voting rights in UNESCO after 2-3 years, but they still were elected on the executive board of the organization and could sit in governing meetings, right? So does the US care? I don't believe so. There's no other, there is some shaming going on, but again, it doesn't work.
I'm curious about something you just said about China paying 20%, but often delaying its payment. Why is that? For China, it's a big thing. For them, it's the foreign policy is about multilateralism, not unilateralism, as they accuse the US of pursuing. And the UN for China, India, all of these countries, the UN is super important. So why is China delaying what it's supposed to pay?
I've tried to find it out, and I know there are journalists trying to research this as we speak, so to say, but I don't know. Unlike the US government that's very openly communicating about everything they are doing, it's not necessarily the way the Chinese government operates in international affairs. But it is a trend of the last 3 years. So what I understand what's happening is they used to pay all of the amount they were due, somewhere early in the year, maybe later than they should legally have to, but early enough for the UN's budget people to plan, the money. As far as I hear, they now pay in 3 installments, a small one in spring, another one in autumn, and then last year, a big one, I think on 27th of December, which from a cash flow perspective is really problematic because if you don't have that cash as the organization, you cannot organize certain activities until the moment the cash comes in. And if you don't know whether it's coming actually in, you're cutting this. So if you get even 100 million or 200 million this late in the year, it's basically lost money, right? And that's actually problematic under the current rules because any amount the UN doesn't spend from its core budget at the end of the year, it has to pay back to member states in the, not next, but after the next budget period. So if the UN cannot spend 500 million because US and China pay late in 2027, so if we talk about 2025, if the budget is 4 billion, member states are obliged to pay only 3.5 billion, and the UN starts with a cash deficit because of not its own fault. We don't know why China is doing it this way, whether it's kind of a signal to the US, saying what you can do, we can do. If it's a way of having more control over what's happening with its increasing share of the budget, by giving it in tranches, they have to have more conversations with the UN administration, and they want that kind of control. It's not publicly communicated. And in the meetings about the financial crisis in the UN, China often doesn't speak on its own, but it speaks as part of the G77 and China group. And that group always says, there's one bad person here in the room that doesn't pay. They don't say US, but they clearly point to one country. And they don't point the finger back to China and say, but one of us is paying late.
What you said about donors or countries, member states earmarking funding, which I know is a huge problem for UN agencies, even the World Bank. So 10, 12 years ago, I was part of a trust fund that the Norwegian and Finnish governments had in the World Bank, Trust Fund on Environmentally and Socially Sustainable Development, TFESSD, and we provided millions of dollars to the World Bank. Not that the World Bank needed so much more money, but to do innovative work. And I must say that some of this work did a lot of good in terms of initial work on inequality that the World Bank wasn't so interested in, but the trust fund money helped in different ways. So it stimulated, different types of research that wasn't being prioritized by core staff. But later on, I also heard that with each trust fund comes reporting structures and just time consuming. And sometimes these international bureaucrats are overburdened, overwhelmed. Rather than, having pooled resources, it's all individual things. So it leads to fragmentation in the system, which is, something that I wish to end our conversation with. One sort of general set of issues related to fragmentation, related to who you think can step up in the absence of the United States. Obviously, one thing has to do with money, but related to this money thing, Ronnie, is also the general criticism that the UN, I mentioned earlier the criticism that the staff get, maybe too much in salaries, but the other criticism is that there's an overlap of functions. Do we really need all of these agencies? Are they all important? Going back to my earlier question, are there some more important, influential? Should we have 5 core agencies? And then I know there's a lot of talk about that. There has been reform. So 2 issues that we can tackle in this final section of our conversation is, one, who can fill the gap that is being left by the US in terms of funding, and whether the global south should step up, whether the EU should be stepping up, our country should be stepping up even more. And number 2 is the kind of reforms that are being undertaken. Do you think, is there hope that some of these criticisms about overlap, about wastage, about being more efficient will be addressed?
The fragmentation of the system is clearly, from everything I've read, all the colleagues who research the administration, the finances, the fragmentation is driven by financing on the one hand, and by disunity in governing bodies, assemblies, general assemblies or WHO assembly and others about common priorities. So let me make a simple argument of how this looks like, right? You are a coalition of 20, states. You want to shift, the attention of an entire UN to do more, sustainable development work in a part of the world. but you are 20 out of 193. You don't get the majority, to agree on this fast enough. You're bogged down in year-long negotiations. And at some point, the 20 of you say, but we still want to achieve this. So we create a trust fund, we put money in there, and we let the trust fund pay, a national body or a UN agency or an NGO or a company to do what we want them to do. As you said, individually, that's a well-meaning decision. But collectively, it means every time you are unhappy about the outcome of the multilateral system, you create a minilateral side system. And then at some point, people say, listen, there are so many minilateral side systems. They are not coordinated. They are overlapping. And then you create new structures to coordinate them. And in those coordination structures, you get the same problems you had from the beginning. That was disagreement about the common goal, right? So you're actually fragmenting the system even further by creating new centralized bodies to get hold of the fragmentation. This is already half an answer for your second question, how hopeful I am that this whole thing will be resolved. I think it will not be resolved unless people, governments, diplomats work more on the stuff they are united on and actually accept to a certain level, which is hard,
that some things don't get the consensus and maybe they are better worked at through regional organizations where you have more consensus on what should be done in the region or certain policies.
Let's just touch on that, the UN reform system. So
yes,
something called UN 80, help us understand.
Yes.
Is it the 80th anniversary of its founding? And what are the core sort of reforms that are being undertaken?
UN 80 has three core streams, right? One, the first stream, which is more focused on the UN Secretariat's core workings, is basically looking at where in this core work of the agency there's corners to be cut. There is a overlap between units, there is a coordination mechanisms on top of coordination mechanisms. And this is closely linked to the financial challenging situation the UN is in, and also a signal to the US, we want to reduce our bureaucracy so you can maybe get back paying again, even though I don't think this is the way the Trump administration works. But at least it's done maybe in this hope. And they are trying to achieve 20% cuts of staff and maybe 15% of funding cuts this year alone. And this is the first stream. The second stream is called the mandate review. And that's basically saying, member states adopt year after year resolutions and declarations where somewhere in the resolution, they ask the UN to do a report, to do X, to do Y. And maybe some of those things are overlapping, but actually different people are doing it across the organization. And if member states could just agree that even though it's two separate legal mandates, it can be combined into a single thing, maybe there is more room for savings. Or maybe member states can prioritize new mandates over old ones, which are still important to some, but not to the full membership. And the third part is trying to reduce the fragmentation of the overall system, which is the hardest thing to do because we have a lot of independent agencies within that system that have their own governance, their own assemblies, that have different funding streams from different donors. But basically it's saying, why do we need 5, development-oriented agencies, 3 agencies doing humanitarian aid? But as I've already said, part of the fragmentation is not the result of bad will to fragment the system, but because donors have different priorities for different organizations. And there is a new PhD thesis from Cecilia Corsini, who showed that even when states manage to put every organization in a different niche, which they try to do with the so-called cluster system for humanitarian interventions. So one agency does the food, the other does the schooling, the third one does the tents, I simplify a little bit. The moment governments say, yeah, we still care about food, but not about tents anymore, do you cut the agency that deals with the tents? Or is that agency suddenly thinking, maybe we should do a bit more of food, but maybe we do it linked to tents, So they are trying to survive, And so there is a pressure to innovate. There's also what you have talked about. Member states, yesterday it was just bringing food. Now it is bringing food, but paying attention to gender and climate change in delivering the food. So one agency that did gender before now wants to be involved in food delivery, while the food delivery agency wants to also do gender, right?
And nobody wants to do less. Nobody
Exactly.
wants to cut. And no member country that is hosting these agencies wants to see their agencies be relocated or just being totally cut down.
And this goes back to our public administration perspective. At national level, you have officials taking decisions about funding, who don't see the full system. I know in the German system, maybe one unit deals with UNHCR, the refugee agency. Another unit deals with IOM, the International Organization for Migration. Those two have overlapping mandates, but you have two units with maybe their own little budgets, dealing with each of them. And only if the level higher cares about, preventing overlap is it happening, right? And this is also why the fragmentation happens, because those people who give out the money are never at the level of the ones who make decisions about the system, right? In New York or at the government level.
What are your thoughts on these rumors? I don't know if they're rumors of a lot of core agencies being moved from New York because it's so expensive to Nairobi. I don't know. Some people are advocating for moving more of these agencies to the global south where it's cheaper. Is that a solution, a viable solution in the long run?
I looked at the statistics what some of those report what they are doing. So in essence, at the moment, many of those that are talking about moving to Nairobi or Bonn or elsewhere from New York or Geneva, they are just moving certain units or departments. They're not moving the entire organization. And here we talk about savings in the 1, 2, maybe 3%, of the overall costs of the organization scale, which means it's maybe a cutting of corner exercise, but it's not bringing the big savings, especially not in the short term, because moving from one headquarter location to another also costs in the first place, right? You need to get new offices, get bigger before you scale down in the old city. So I think there is nothing bad about thinking about where in the world should the UN system be present at what size, because maybe, there is historical reasons that everything is in Geneva and New York, but it wasn't necessarily built for a global system that functions, with a priority on Africa, that has a stronger power center in Asia. So I don't think it's bad to think about the decentralization or to the rearrangement of the system, but it shouldn't be done as a cost-saving exercise because, unless you move everything from New York to Bangkok, will you actually realize if you are making true savings by doing that, or if you now have everybody flying from Bangkok to the rest of the world to do stuff that's the same costs, as New York.
I've visited some of these UN campuses, compounds in Nairobi and Addis Ababa. There are these regional headquarters. And one of the things that I heard, particularly in Nairobi, was that people who were posted there loved it because it was clean air and nice facilities, value for money. UN salaries go a lot far if you live there. So there was the weather, there was this kind of excitement. I wanted to just make my listeners aware of how you've jumped off the academic trail, academic career, and you've become this influential person doing this really important work. And maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the website and what you wish to do, but also maybe why you jumped off the academic career path.
I've been in core academia, working at universities for about a decade now, until January this year, 2025. Before that, I worked for a couple of years for an NGO in Brussels, Transparency International, which is a global anti-corruption NGO. And before that, I was doing my PhD, but more as an independent researcher. So after 10 years in core academia in Germany, I wanted to shift to a much more local life than what academic life is about. Academic careers mean almost like a diplomat. You hop from one university to the other until you finally find your final base. And at some point, I decided I want my base to be where I live now in a small town, maybe an hour outside Berlin. It's relatively close to where my original home is. And I decided I prioritize local life over professional life. And then I find myself work around that. Until early this year, I worked at Potsdam University, which is a university just outside Berlin. But my project ended and I decided I want to maybe shift to a more local job in local administration or business, or because I also didn't see, and this is to your first question, I didn't see a big interest in my core knowledge on UN financing, UN bureaucracy. I've been quite active on Twitter for the last decade with a good followership, but the UN stuff was never something that really was enthusiastic for the masses, so to say. And so at some point during my sabbatical in spring, I started to just write 1 or 2 posts on LinkedIn, and the reactions were much more intensive than I'd ever seen. So I continued to write, and now I write almost daily on LinkedIn about the UN 80 reform process, about the financial crisis. And everything I write is linked on my blog, which you find at ronnie-patz.de. And on this blog, I link everything I put on LinkedIn because, as with many social media these days, the LinkedIn algorithm makes it really hard to find stuff. So every post I write on LinkedIn can be found linked on my blog. So I've decided to work as a freelance now for a couple of months. I've done a crowdfunding, which is still running, where people can contribute to my commentary. I do small, still academic analysis and a think tank work at the moment, but I'm not sure I'm going to stay in this world. So my plan is to be this commentator until the end of the year, which I think the fall will be the big crunch time for the UN crisis and for UN reform discussions. And then maybe for the beginning of next year, I need to quiet down a little bit and find myself a different niche here in my local life. But, you should never say never. I didn't expect to be where I am now. So who knows where I will be in January 2026.
Well, you're doing a fantastic public service, and I've learned quite a lot from reading your posts on LinkedIn, and not least enjoyed this conversation very much today, Ronnie. Thank you very much for coming on my show.
Thank you for having me, Dan. It's really a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to In Pursuit of Development with Professor Dan Bannock from the University of Oslo. Please email your questions, comments and suggestions to inpursuitofdevelopment@gmail.com.